Marcel Van Hattem, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So we have a shared friend in Michael Shellenberger.
Yeah.
And he was telling me about the things happening in Brazil. I've been sort of peripherally paying attention to it, but when I saw you were here, I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity to hear about some of the things happening in a country that in a lot of ways I feel like is similar to the United States, in that, Brazil is a big country. It is ethnically diverse in somewhat uniquely, like the U.S. relative to the rest of the world. And you are part of Brazilian politics. And I think, I would just love to hear from your perspective, what has happened with censorship, with the turnover from left to right. So let's just start with the Twitter battle in Brazil. What happened there?
Well, so much stuff to tell. But thank you again for having me. And Michael Shellenberger is a true hero for us in Brazil right now, because he really started this whole Twitter Files Brazil story together with two Brazilian journalists, David Agape and Oliveira Jr. And they reviewed what happened in Twitter before it was taken over by Elon Musk. So very interesting to see. And my name was there too in his reports and his stories, because I was censored during the elections in 2022, just right after. And many other people were. So the elections in 2022 in Brazil, the general elections, I participated as a candidate for re-election in as a congressman. Bolsonaro and Lula was running for president. I'm sure that Lula benefited, and this is just like facts, from this censorship on Bolsonaro supporters and on himself during that period. And the Supreme Court and the Brazilian Electoral Court were absolutely essential for this to happen. So they took off many tweets that they considered were offensive or were anti-democratic or were simply against Lula, as a defamation tweet or whatever. They even censored newspapers then, like Gazeta do Povo had a whole story about how Lula was close to Ortega and to Maduro. The newspaper couldn't even tell the readers that, which is crazy, because now we see how close Lula, in fact, is with them, and the history showed that before. So that story on the Twitter Files Brazil that Michael Shellenberger wrote with these two Brazilian journalists was very important, because that was April last year. And from then on, we saw also how this censorship industrial complex in America helped also the Brazilian left to gain power and now to remain in power. All this USAID, right? USAID, how do you call it? USAID, right? Story.
USAID. It's like the greatest scam ever. Let's name a thing so it sounds humanitarian. Instead of actually being some confluence of state and CIA international nonsense.
Fact checkers in Brazil were funded by, fact checkers, right? I hate this, but this is what they were, like, fact checkers.
They're stripping the world of facts, the fact checkers. They check the facts at the door.
I was a victim of them, because they have their own facts, right? And they tell my audience what my facts are, and my facts are wrong. It's crazy, but anyways. So fact checkers, media outlets, even NGOs funded with American taxpayers' money to persecute, to oppress the Brazilian opposition to Lula and to PT. Now, this is still, we still don't know how far it went. You don't know here in America either.
No.
But that is subject to investigation in the coming months for sure.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. To take one step back to Lula versus Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
So for those in our audience, we have very much an American audience. Bolsonaro to the extent people have been exposed to him, was depicted in the U.S. as a Trump-like figure and authoritarian and brutish, and this was the depiction that we received in the States of Bolsonaro. And then Lula, frankly, Lula didn't get the kind of coverage here that Bolsonaro did in general. So what's your perspective on, who Bolsonaro is and was from a political perspective? Like, what has the U.S. coverage of him gotten right and wrong?
Well, Bolsonaro, for sure, he has his own manners, and for many people are like bad manners. But the way he spoke, the way he communicated himself was not always like something that people, especially some people, would feel like this is a way a president should be behaving or communicating, which is pretty much like Trump, right? Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about. The thing
or
is,
Javier Milei, for that
of
matter.
Javier Milei, yes, for sure, yeah. But the thing with Bolsonaro in Brazil is that his government started in 2019, the same time when the Supreme Court in Brazil was being accused, or at least some of the members of the Supreme Court, of being involved in corruption schemes. So we have to remember that Lula was in jail until November 2019. So Lula was in jail.
What was he in jail for?
For corruption, for money laundering. So he was almost 2 years in jail until he was released in November 2019 in the car wash operation scandal. So was it called, the car wash operation? That not only Lula went to jail, but many politicians, businessmen, actually those businessmen, crony capitalists and so on. In April 2019, there was a magazine called Cruzoé, it still exists in Brazil, that dared to publish a story on the friend of my father, who was actually how the Chief Justice at the time in Brazil, Dias Toffoli, he's still one of the justices in the Supreme Court, that the Chief Justice received bribes from the same businessman from Odebrecht that also bribed Lula and other people. And they put this in their magazine, in the cover of the magazine. And this is when the Supreme Court started the censorship in Brazil. They started censoring that one magazine because it was supposedly fake news, right? So at that time, the media in Brazil was not okay with censorship. It's very strange to say that media is okay with censorship, but today, it's the same here in America.
Yeah, the U.S. media, the corporate press has decided that, censorship is great so long as it's censoring their competitors, basically.
Exactly. But at the time, it was seen like, no, you've gone too far. You can't censor Cruzoé for it because, we've been covering all these scandals since like 2015, 16. The car wash operation was an operation that was actually seen as a very serious operation in Brazil. And that put so many people in prison, politicians and businessmen alike. So they actually backed down from this censorship. Alexandre de Moraes was the one who censored the magazine, so they decided not to censor anymore. You still can find the story. But then, instead of continuing to target traditional media, they started to target Bolsonaro supporters. And the digital militia, as they called, the supporters of Bolsonaro that would use social media, to attack opponents or to simply say things, truth or true or not, but things that they believed in, and were started to be depicted as radicals, people that are anti-democratic and that they are organized. They were actually only doing politics, but online, right? Like you would do on the streets with pamphlets, now you do it online. And they started to target Bolsonaro supporters. From that moment onwards, we saw an escalation in Brazil of political persecution against Bolsonaro supporters or people on the right. We saw also that Lula, for instance, who was still in jail, was released in November that year, and later all his processes were nullified. All his cases before court were considered canceled because allegedly the place where it all started in Curitiba was not the right place where it should be judged. It should be judged in other court. Whatever it was a technicality they used to cancel all the processes against Lula, the cases that were against him, the criminal cases.
Was there strong material evidence that Lula was getting money and doing?
Yeah. He had apartment. He had a house in the countryside. All that were clearly bought with money from bribing schemes and from corruption, money laundering, and so on. And Lula was then allowed to, go back to the political arena and run again against Bolsonaro, who in Brazil was also depicted as the guy that was, anti-democratic, that was against the institutions. And he picked, that is maybe something that he shouldn't, maybe he thinks in retrospect that he exaggerated too, because he had too many enemies at the same time, right? So he actually started to fight everybody at the same time, and this had a price for him later in the election, because it was actually really the whole deep state, the media, and everybody against him. And Lula was seen as a savior of democracy, right? So Lula is a socialist. Lula is a guy from a workers' party that founded in 1990 the Foro de São Paulo together with Fidel Castro. So in 1990 they founded the Foro de São Paulo, which is a group of parties on the left, also terrorist organizations in Latin America. And the motto of the Foro de São Paulo is to recover or to win back what was lost in Eastern Europe. So they wanted really to have, it still exists, the Foro de São Paulo, right? They gather every year, and their objective is to turn Latin America into what the Eastern Europe was in the past.
So a new Latin Soviet Union, basically.
Yeah, that's their aim. So Lula was never a Democrat, right? In the sense,
right,
defending democratic principles. Nevertheless, because Bolsonaro was seen, as this guy that doesn't have good manners and is always attacking everybody, and because he's attacking people many times with words, it seemed like if he's attacking institutions, they decided that Lula should be, the winner of the election. And they did everything they could, and Lula, in the end, won the elections in Brazil in 2022. And Bolsonaro is now the one who is facing charges of trying to attempt a coup d'etat, right? Because of January 8th, which is also a big farce, like your January 6th, but even worse, I'd say.
So what happened on January 8th?
Well, Lula won the election in the end of October 2022. Until December, 31st of December, Bolsonaro was still in power. On January 1st is when the new president took office. During this period, people who were unsatisfied with the results of the elections, Brazilians that always supported Bolsonaro or on the right, they were in front of the headquarters of the army in Brasilia and in other places around the country. I always said that was not the right place to be. I mean, you shouldn't be asking the army to do something. You should ask the politicians, for instance, us, like Congress. But anyways, people decided to do that, and in Brasilia they stayed until the 8th of January. This is actually the date when Lula was already in power, that thousands of people went from the headquarters of the army in Brasilia, walking down, maybe 1.5, 2 miles, until the place where all the three powers are, like the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Planalto Palace. That's the presidential palace, and they went there. And unfortunately, some people just started, to break things and invade,
turn into a riot,
yes,
or a mob activity.
Yeah. So these people were there, and some were. Well, there's some things that have to be said about that. Like the federal government knew something was coming and did nothing about it. Like they just let.
Sounds familiar again.
Right. And second, I'm pretty much convinced with all the relations that the PT has with Cuba and Venezuela, there was definitely people infiltrated there to help. And there were even suggestions that there were people inside the buildings already breaking everything before the others, ordinary citizen that was enraged got in. And many people that were there, Brazilians that were like always peacefully demonstrating, said their videos on that, said, don't break anything. This is not the way we have to proceed.
Yeah.
Well, anyways. So some people were put in prison or brought to jail on site because they were inside the buildings, even though they didn't break anything or whatever. There was no proof or evidence of that. They were sent to prison. And some people went back to the headquarters, and some people arrived to the headquarters of the military that night. They weren't even there on the site because there were buses still coming, because the demonstrations went on and nobody thought really that on January 8th they would stop. People would just continue to be on the streets. Well, next morning, the federal police puts buses in front of the headquarters of the army, and they ask people to get into the buses. They don't say where they're going to be taken, but what they do is actually bring them to jail. More than 1,400 people. Even though some of those people were not in the site the day before, or they did not break anything, they would, brought to prison.
Just mass arrested.
Yes. So 2 weeks later, I went to prison because I saw, up till then, I was not involved in any of this, of course. I'm not even a Bolsonarista or a hardcore Bolsonarista, as they call it in Brazil. I'm independent. I'm from a libertarian conservative party called Novo. And when you see the images, you see, how can people do that? It goes abroad and it gives you the sense that this was real, right?
Yeah.
So I went to jail and I talked to people. And when I started to talk to people, and I heard even the guy that was just selling flags, Brazilian flags, that was in jail, and they were there for 2 weeks at the time with no proof of evidence, anything that they really did something. So I thought, this is so wrong. And this is when I started to get involved in January 8th cases. And this is why I'm still very shocked that neither in Brazil nor internationally, people understand how bad these people are still being treated. There are people that spend more than a year in prison. They're still with ankle bracelets at home, because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Without charges
without anything,
against them?
Nothing. There's a guy even called Clezão that died in prison in November. He was with poor health conditions. There were images inside of the Senate showing that he did nothing. He was just sitting there, He arrived after the riots occurred, and still he died in prison. So this is just so bad, so grave. This is just January 8th events.
Yeah.
But it's very important to tell about this because now it's been 2 years. And this is what allowed Lula to govern up till now without the opposition that he would have otherwise, of people in the streets demanding him to resign and so on, as we did in the past with Dilma, because people started to get afraid to take to the streets and protest. And they continued with operations against, like every 2 weeks we have an operation, and they go after people that supposedly have funded like the buses or had paid for food in the camps. So they continued to arrest people and to make people get frightened to make opposition in Brazil. That's how they operate.
How, we have the First Amendment.
Yeah.
We have a legal structure in the U.S. that I understand to be, for all its flawed implementation, some of the strongest protections for freedom of speech and assembly in the world.
Definitely.
What is the, on paper at least, legal protections for speech and assembly in Brazil?
We have Article 5, that's our fundamental rights. It has dozens of subsections, and in Article 5 you have freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, and we have a second time freedom of speech in Article 220.
This is of the Brazilian Constitution?
Brazilian Constitution, yeah, sorry. So we have on paper everything we need, but when it comes to a constitutional court or an electoral court that is behaving unconstitutionally, you can do nothing about it. And the worst part of it is that they say that they are defending the Constitution by disrespecting it. It's crazy.
The ends justify the means.
Yeah, that's what we see happening in Brazil now. Yeah.
What was I want to move forward from January 8th, but if Bolsonaro is currently being pursued legally by the Lula administration. What was his role in January 8th? Like, what's the charge?
He wasn't even in Brazil then.
What was he tweeting at people? Go, go, go. What was the situation?
No, not even. He was actually very quiet about the situation. He never said publicly to people to go there. There's no evidence that he did it even he was very depressed actually when he lost the election, and he stayed quiet at home for weeks. And on December 30th, that's just 1 day before or 2 days before Lula took office, he went to Florida with the presidential plane and was in America. So there's little doubt that if Bolsonaro was in Brazil when January 8th events happened, they would probably put him in jail right away and charge him with something he cannot be charged of. Because even the new Speaker of the House said yesterday in an interview in Brazil that you cannot say that that was an attempted coup d'etat because there was no leader, there was no involvement of any other institution like the armed forces, people were not... They did not have guns on them. They have like Brazilian flags, even Bibles. So, I mean, and old ladies, we had old ladies of 60, 70 years in jail for months because of that. So it's impossible to call them like attempted coup d'etat.
This is the new invention of the 21st century. You can have insurrections where no one brings a weapon.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's
you
crazy.
You can call it, it's not good, but it's not an insurrection if no one brings any guns.
Yeah. Just
right? Am I crazy?
No, you're completely right. And this is the situation. Of course, you could say, and I said this because again, I'm independent.
I don't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Was there a breach? And my ignorance hopefully is useful for the viewer. Was there even a breach of the building? Because in January 6th, at least you could say...
Well, there was, but there was no killings or whatsoever, because he is, regrettably, people died, right, during January 6th. So on January 8th, we did not have anything like it. But we had, like, very strange footage from videos, like, inside, at some point, like... 1 or 2 months after the January 8th events, CNN, Brazil CNN, it's actually surprising to say so, but Brazilian CNN released some footage from videos taken inside the Planalto Palace. That's the presidential palace.
Yeah.
And you could see that one of the ministers, the minister of that is responsible for the security of the president, was serving like water for the people who were inside. And at some point, you saw a Reuters photographer. There was a rioter that went there and kicked the door, and the photographer was taking a picture inside. I don't know how he got inside it. And then the rioter goes back and look at the camera to see if the picture was well taken. And
the rioter did.
Yeah, the rioter did. I mean, they were actually working together. Yeah, is it a good shot or no? Oh, great. He says, oh, great. And then they clap their hands and, it's crazy. And this guy, this Reuters guy, he deleted his Twitter account, but we could recover many of his posts. And his posts were always like in favor of Lula or with his supporters and so on. And he did not appear before. The government, the Lula government did not approved. They had enough votes, alas, in the Senate, did not approve this photographer to go to a public hearing to give explanations on it, because there was an inquiry there in the Senate, but unfortunately, or in Congress actually, because there were senators and representatives, but unfortunately, we were minorities position in that case. And there's another thing. Flávio Dino, the Minister of Justice, who is now Justice in the Supreme Court, he was then Secretary of Justice of Lula. 3 months later or so, the Congress requested through this commission all images from his building. You know what he said? Unfortunately, the contract said in 15 days all images are deleted. And they deleted all the images that they have from inside his building. So it's just... It resembles with January 6th? Because Michael Shellenberger has a theory that he wants like comparable things.
It's there's a lot of parallels there that are really bizarre.
Right.
One of the things that is, and you already alluded to it, is this USAID scheme. This massive tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
I think as an American that is skeptical, I love America. I believe in our founding principles profoundly.
Yeah.
I am skeptical of some of our activities with the CIA and military-industrial complex out there in the world. And South America has a long history of the U.S., in the name of the Cold War, messing around.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's created a lot of weird, it's created a lot of excuses for people like the Venezuelan regimes to blame all their problems on the U.S. Instead of on communism. How do you understand the U.S. role in your country, in Brazil? USAID, the Biden administration, the CIA. How have we been messing with you guys?
Yeah, we were talking about this last week in Congress. There was a hearing in a committee about immigration and how we will suffer now in Brazil from the lack of support of the United States to people who are coming from Venezuela through our borders. About 300 people a day cross the Venezuelan border to Brazil still. You have to remember that 25% of the Venezuelan population live abroad today. So that's because of the regime there.
Yeah. Well, communists need to build walls to keep their people in.
Yeah, crazy, but that's how it is. So, and we were discussing what to do now because American money was very important for this, right? Because it's called the Operação Acolhida, which is like the operation to make people feel comfortable coming to Brazil. The acolhida is like acolhimento to I don't know the exact word in English right now, but it's like having people, comfortable in another place. So this operation is now under risk because it's the Brazilian military who does it, but with basically also American money. And I was commenting on this this week, and last week, I said two things. First, looking at, of course, the positive side of it is that now we can see more. We can blame the right guys for doing what they're doing, and this is Maduro and Lula. Actually, they should be paying for it in the end because it's their responsibility. Because Lula has been sponsoring Maduro's regime, is friends with Maduro for so many years. And I told you about the photo of São Paulo as well. But the second thing I said, maybe it has to make us reflect on how American money has been used by one side to make these regimes grow stronger and on the other side to relieve the pain of the victims of these regimes. Because if you look at the USAID, this money has been sponsoring NGOs in Brazil, and why not in Venezuela maybe, that are on the left, that are actually causing all this pain and this suffering to these people. So in the end, American taxpayers' money are being used twice. Once to create the situation, and second, to try to relieve the pain of those who are victims of the situation.
It's we're like
it's interesting, isn't it?
We're like a foreign policy hedge fund. It's I think about the ongoing wars between Iraq and Iran.
Yeah,
and U.S. support at different times was on both sides, sometimes at the same time.
Yeah.
So how do you think about, and how do the Brazilian people on average, let's say, from your perspective, think about America as a force? Are we seen as a force for good or as a force for evil in South America and in Brazil in particular?
Well, it can be both, naturally. It can always be both. But I tend to see it as a force for good, because the American society is based on these principles that you say you cherish so much, like the principle of the founding fathers. We see that this is a bottom up built society, and this is very important for us to see how it works here. Brazil was a country without people but with government back in the day when it was, say, discovered. It's a whole different story. It's a whole different situation, and we have to learn a lot from America. But going to the specific of America too, like, of course America can do evil as well, as it has been doing through taxpayers' money being sent to organizations that are demolishing our democracy or persecuting people like me. But now that is under Trump administration. We hope that many things can change for the better. And actually, there is one specific event that I hope will be unveiled here, and that we will get to the person or the persons that contributed to an unjust imprisonment in Brazil through defrauding documents in the CBP in Orlando. I don't know if you're aware of this case.
No.
But Felipe Martins, it's a very interesting case. And I'm indicted now by the federal police of Lula because of this case. I'm going to get there. So it's great. I'm indicted. You're in front of an indicted politician. I mean,
I think Michael said that he's in hot water with the Brazilian regime as well, isn't he?
Is he
not like allowed to
monitored. Go? No, he is. But he's definitely being monitored, and we're doing all we can, every time he comes to preserve him But in my case, I use my right as a politician, actually as a member of the Brazilian Congress, to denounce a federal police agent for using false information to keep somebody in jail, in this case, Felipe Martins. And because of my speech, instead of investigating this federal police agent, the Brazilian federal police started to investigate me. And was granted authorization by the Supreme Court to do so. I mean, parliamentary immunity is there in the world since 1689, since the Bill of Rights in England. I mean, that's why you are a representative, right? If you don't have the right to say whatever you want, to express yourself, there's no democracy anymore. And I'm now indicted because I actually exposed this whole situation. So the situation is the following. Felipe Martins was an advisor to Jair Bolsonaro in international relations. Last year in February, he had a visit from the federal police, and they brought him to jail. Why? Because he allegedly was the one who wrote a minute for the attempted coup d'etat, its whole story, whatever it is. And he was sent to jail because he had supposedly taken the same plane to Florida that Bolsonaro took in December 2022. And because he went to Florida with Bolsonaro back then, more than a year before, he might leave the country again, so he should go to jail. Okay, so when they discovered, the defense of Felipe Martins, because first of all these cases, they are all like under secrecy. The lawyers don't have access. It's very difficult. After some weeks, 2 or 3 maybe, that they discovered on what grounds he was in jail, the defense petitioned the court, Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and said, hey, he can't be in jail for that reason because he did not go with Bolsonaro to the United States. He was not in that plane. So instead of releasing him from jail, because they had all proof of evidence, they had like all his domestic flights he took in Brazil during that period, they had all his Uber rides that he took, all his telephone, like the antennas of the telephone. They had all evidence.
So you could prove he was in Brazil.
He was in Brazil. Actually, Mary O'Grady wrote a very good piece on it for the Wall Street Journal called Who Framed Felipe Martins. Very interesting. Maybe it's interesting to put the link below later if you can on the description of this video. So they proved he did not leave Brazil. So what Justice Alexandre de Moraes did, even the prosecutor general said, okay, yes, he did not leave Brazil, please release him from jail. Instead of releasing him from jail like 3 weeks or 1 month later, Justice Alexandre de Moraes asked the federal police to make new diligences. And so they did. So they
find me some other reason to keep this guy in jail.
And then they and that's why I accused this federal police agent to use false information. They use a travel history. Travel history, every one of us have. If you go to the CBP or Orlando, you must be shocked. If you go there, you put your passport details, you'll see every travel you did abroad, date, and, when you got in and out of the country. Sometimes, actually, the travel history is not very accurate because sometimes you check in for a flight, you don't take it, and it's still there. That is why the travel history website said you cannot use this for legal purposes. You can be prosecuted if you do so. Regardless, federal police of Brazil used that information on this travel history that showed Felipe Martins had left the country to prove that he indeed was with Bolsonaro on that flight. So the defense of Felipe Martins sent an email to the CBP in Orlando saying, hey, that's very strange. How is his name in the travel history if he did not take the flight? So the first answer of the CBP on Orlando to this email was, oh yeah, you're right. The last time he went to the United States, he entered the United States with the I-94, which is the formal entry registration in the United States, was in JFK last September. That was when Bolsonaro, September 22, when Bolsonaro was at the UN General Assembly. Okay, so they sent this information to the media, and the media said, oh, now there's a proof that Felipe Martins did not enter the United States. What did the Brazilian federal police do? I don't know how. We have to discover. That's why we have to trust on the Trump administration to do an investigation into this. They provided new information in the case with his passport and with the I-94 in his diplomatic passport. But the diplomatic passport they used was one that was even canceled, invalid, one that he lost. Very strange. So they sent a new email to the CBP. Look, he did not do this trip, but if he had, he would use this passport, which is the valid one. So the CBP in Orlando this time just answers very shortly like, okay, we'll correct the information. And they put the new passport instead of taking out information that he really had entered the United States. So after he's released from jail, 6 months in jail, Mary O'Grady writes, many people write, the media in Brazil is, saying this can't go on because he really did not go to the United States. He's released from jail. I go to his place 2 days after. I am there with him and his wife, and they show me all evidence. And I said, now I'm convinced that he was completely unjustly imprisoned, and I'm going to speak about this in the House floor. And then I get the picture of this federal police agent called Fabio Alvarez-Shore, and I show it in the Tribune behind the microphone. I said, this guy is abusing his authority. This guy is using false information to keep this Brazilian in prison, or used to keep him in prison. We have to find out who defrauded the information into the CBP in Orlando, and therefore we want the Lula government to find it out. So instead of investigating what I said, they started to investigate me, and the rest is what I told you already. Now I'm indicted by the federal police.
I know our time...
It's a long story. I'm sorry, but
this is so...
It's so difficult to explain everything.
We've spent several years watching this kind of nonsense happen here in the U.S. So it used to be at least a story we'd tell ourselves that this is the kind of stuff that happens in South America, but here in America, no, we have rule of law.
This is the thing that surprised me the most, because when they were showing me all evidence, I arrived at his place 11 p.m., right? Because he was just released from jail. He didn't know exactly what night and day was 2 days later, and that was the time I had. I stayed at his place until 6 a.m., looking at all evidence they showed me on the screen and so on. And if I didn't see with my own eyes, I would probably doubt it all. But when you see that an American official helped in that, it's like, no, this is going too far. This is impossible. How can that be? So somebody in the CBP in Orlando did it. And I hope the current administration find that out, because especially this administration that is so concerned about illegal immigration and all this, imagine they could fake the entry registration of a terrorist. Who knows? Or take it out of the system.
Real quick before we move on to the Twitter conflict. What's the CBP? What does that mean?
Custom and Border Patrol.
Gotcha.
When you get inside a country in the United States, you pass the CBP, and it's under the DHS.
So the Biden Border Patrol agency was changing documents at the request of Lula to help in the falsification of charges against this man.
The only thing I cannot confirm is that it was that Lula has requested it, but because I can get in trouble also, because then I'm making an accusation without proof of evidence. But it's highly likely, because why would a member of the CBP, why would an official in the CBP do it if he weren't working, or she, together with the Brazilian authorities, to persecute somebody? Why would they do that?
One of the things that was striking to me in the run-up to this election in the United States between Trump and Harris was that the leaders of the Democratic Party in America, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, John Kerry, were all speaking in one very consistent voice that they want government censorship. The Biden administration attempted to create an office of misinformation, a kind of ministry of truth, in the Department of Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, which is above CBP.
So there was we really did face an ideology that really seems to be a kind of global coordination.
Correct.
There was efforts between the U.S. progressive political class to coordinate with London and the U.K. and that in censorship. The U.K. has become absolutely barbaric on this front. Mm-hmm. And so for Americans hearing this story, what's your warning to us about what is going on internationally when it comes to the attacks on free speech and the coordination between anti-speech left-wing governments against all of us?
Yeah. Well, I think we're starting to win this battle again, my opinion. I have to remain hopeful anyways, but I think we're starting to win this again with the Twitter files, with everything that has been exposed, with USAID, being internationally known and so on. But we have to remember that this is actually just a reaction from the elites, from the deep state, to a trend from 10, 15 years, maybe 20. That's like the social media taking over, right? So you see traditional media have lost audience, and have lost, what audience means subscribers, of course, and have lost sponsors and ads. And this went to social media. Yeah. So they have to get their money from somewhere, right? At least in Brazil, where do they go? To the government.
And the UK, for that matter, BBC
and UK as well, right?
Canada. I mean, even the US. We've got NPR and PBS.
Traditional media is dying. So I took my master's in journalism in Denmark in 2011. Was the first year, and the second year I actually finished with a gap of 4 years in between in 2017. So the much the media has changed in just that 4 years while I was studying it. It was just amazing, and you know how much it has changed in the last 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, tremendously.
So what we see is that in the past, we had like this media conglomerate, like they were like considered in Brazil, we call it the fourth power, right? So you have the legislative, the executive, the judiciary, and the media that should control all of them, right?
In the US, we say the fourth estate.
The fourth estate. Yeah. Okay, so you get what I say. So in the end, that model doesn't exist anymore. That model that was until like 2008, 9, 10, until we had like Facebook, and X was there before a little bit of Facebook. We had Orkut before ICQ, but let's stick to X and Facebook, and then Instagram and all this. It has reshaped the communication arena, and that made ordinary citizens, that gave power to so many people that could expose also what bad journalists were doing, right, and what bad politicians were doing too. So in the beginning, as I see it, at least in the beginning, there was like a sort of maybe that's good. Yeah, we're seeing like in Brazil, corruption is being fought for the first time. We're seeing what's getting, what's happening in the shadows. That's good. But because this movement grew and grew and grew, and they started to get to people like in Brazil, even to the Supreme Court, but maybe that's not as good as we thought it was. And maybe we have to react to that. And
you can reform,
the reactions right now. Yeah.
but don't reform too much.
Do you remember Yes We Can? That was 2008 with Obama. It was like, whoa, social media is great, wasn't it?
Yeah, of course, right.
So, and the left was against censorship. That's what Michael Shellenberger always said. He came from the left, and he was always fighting censorship, right? Coming from other parties, not from the left.
Well, you had a moment, at least in the United States, where they called it the New Left, and you had the reaction against the Vietnam War, and so you had the kind of classic hippie Berkeley student free speech type movement in opposition to Vietnam. But in a lot of ways, that really seems historically like a blip because it has been the statist left that has been the oppressor when it comes to free speech across the world, across continents and creeds, in the form
Soviet Union,
the fascists who are fundamentally, ultimately left-wing.
Yeah, Nazis and so on,
So what happens next? So as I understand it, is X still banned?
No.
Did X pull out of Brazil? What happened in the conflict between Elon and Lula?
Well, money matters. Let's put it that way. Money matters, and the United States funding to institutions like the OAS, for instance, will be very important in the coming days. We have now the OAS rapporteur for freedom of speech going to Brazil, and he's going to interview people.
What's OAS?
The Organization of American States. So they have the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and they should actually defend human rights, but in the last years they've remained silent regarding Brazil. So what I see now, it's a shift, because they fear losing funds, because 50% of OAS is maintained by American taxpayers' money again, right? So now they have to work in our direction, or in the direction that the Trump administration wants, unless they want to keep, have a cut of 50% in their salaries and their funds and so on. So unfortunately, we have this going on when it comes to Trump administration and importance in the international context. But we also have what we say now in Brazil, a constant struggle against those who are the owners of the power in Brazil. And this is why I said it's not necessarily a left or right situation. Of course, we see that the left is working for censorship, but we see that many parties in the center and many people like in the judiciary, or people that cling to power for so many years, they are afraid of all this and they want censorship, not necessarily because they're against the ideas on the right, but just because they don't want to lose their positions, right? They don't want to be challenged in the positions.
So status quo, sort of corporatists.
Exactly. So what we see now, and I think it's going to grow in the coming years, is popular unrest, people taking to the streets again in Brazil, and this will lead to reforms again. We are a country of people that go to the streets quite often, and we did it in 1990s with the president called Fernando Collor, later with Dilma Rousseff in 2014, and I see it going again, especially now with the economy going as bad as we're seeing in Brazil.
I understand, the inflation rate in Brazil is quite high. Paint a quick picture. What is the economic situation in Brazil?
It is like this. President Lula went to the TV yesterday and said to people, look, if you think a product is too expensive, just don't buy it. Wait until it gets rotten, because the price will go down, or just wait until it's almost rotten because the prices will go down, and then you buy it. This is the situation. Even Lula don't know how to deal with that. It's just so crazy.
Is it just central bank money printing?
Well,
what's going on?
Well, basically what we have now is public expenditure that is too high. So we have also state-run companies. There are more than 500 or 600 state-run companies. Even the government doesn't know exactly how many it has, and they're all also in bribing schemes and in deficit and so on. And the international context is not as good as it was in the past when Lula was president for the first time. So it's going to be very challenging, and because the government doesn't inspire trust, the economy is also, slowing down. You see it because I was last week with the guy from the agro sector, and he said, we have everything here, and Brazil is an agro power, but because we don't know what the future will be in Brazil in the coming year or two, we are not able to sell as we did in the past.
I know you're gonna have to. We're gonna have to wrap things up for you for your next appointment.
No, that's a shame, but
One of the things that I think we in the States are grappling with is what is a healthy role for the U.S. and in the world. And President Trump has come to power more skeptical of foreign entanglements mostly than prior administrations on both the left and the right. He's not a neocon, although he wants to buy Gaza and turn it into condominiums. That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
But how do you, as someone who believes in the sort of I'd say like the best of American ideals, believes in individual liberty, believes in rule of law, how do you see the role that America plays or could play for good? And can it change? I'm very worried that we're not really playing a very good role, and that maybe the best thing we should do is just leave everyone alone and mind our own business. That's kind of my default.
Yeah.
How do you think about that as a Brazilian?
I agree with you, and this is something Americans should be worried about. Indeed, I mean, Trump. I just rolled my eyes on the Gaza suggestion of Trump, because he even know it's like. He's not going to do that, right? It's actually even against international law. It's almost an ethical cleansing, right? Taking everybody out and putting. I mean, but that's the way he behaved.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, well, in the sense
it's different.
You want for sure that these people get economic development. We agree on that, and we want for sure that American businesses move there. That's for sure as well.
I guess
I would love that. Yeah, to go to Gaza or to Brazil and to have Brazilian business there. Why not? At some time, have Gaza businesses also coming over, because everybody profits from international trade. What we have in Gaza specifically, by the way, is actually a state that has been run by a terrorist group, and all these guys that engage in absurd terrorist attacks. They were all in their 17s, 18s, 20s. They didn't hear anything else than all this indoctrination of Hamas there. And this is very sad. So we see Brazil, for instance, contributing to it too, because PT has through the MST, the landless movement of Brazil, people who claim they don't have a land to produce agricultural products, they have a partnership with Hamas, and they go every year there to harvest olives. Can you believe that? So. They say so, but actually they're actually there to, engage in whatever activities are, but certainly there's
a weird international, like left-wing Islamic thing that's going on. We saw it on campuses. We've got the Queers for Palestine. Yeah. It's like, how do you end up in that coalition?
But then exactly.
The weirdest coalition imaginable.
But then is the question. We don't want to interfere in other countries, right? And I don't want to interfere in other countries. But on the other hand, many of these other countries want to interfere and want to do bad things to us, right? As, by the way, Americans unfortunately experienced in 2001 with the terrorist attacks and so on, that were funded by foreign governments too. So it's a very difficult situation. How do you get out of it, right? I think we'll never have the right answer to it. I think you have to interfere the less you can, but always be aware that something bad can come from abroad too. So you have to invest in your army, in your military, and Europe has been learning this the worst way possible right now with all that's happening in Ukraine, and how they actually depend on American funding to help Ukraine in this in its position now. So it's very difficult. This is an old saying, right? If you want peace, prepare for war. It's very difficult, but that would be my answer, without interfering abroad, or at least the least possible you can.
My last question for you, freedom of speech and expression is our First Amendment in the United States. It is really the bedrock of all of the other rights, because it's the bedrock of thought, because if you can't explore ideas, if you can't hear different points of view, you can't know anything, including yourself.
Yeah.
What is your message to America and to your fellow people in Brazil about that? Like, why is it so important to protect freedom of speech? And what are the threats mounting on the horizon?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say, or most important of all, I would say, if they try to censor you and to silence you, don't comply. I mean, you have to speak up, and louder if you can. This is my rule to it. So every time someone tries to, shut my mouth down or shut my mouth up, I just say, again, what I said before. Of course, there are consequences. Of course, it is difficult. Many people won't do that. Actually, most will just comply and just be quiet. But if you're watching this, I mean, people who are watching it now, don't comply. I mean, if it is unconstitutional, it is unconstitutional, period. Just say whatever you like, say whatever it is. And of course, there are some limits put in some legislation regarding some kind of speeches. That is the case in many countries. But we, as legislators as well, have to always take care not to put any limits in freedom of speech that will prevent people from speaking up their minds and saying what they think regarding politics, religion, and so on and so forth. So it's a very nice discussion. I'm totally in favor of freedom of speech, and I will continue defending it in Brazil. And I normally said, when I was living abroad and I came back to Brazil, because Brazil is a different country, of course, than the United States or the Netherlands or Denmark, where freedom of speech is stronger than in Brazil, for instance, historically also. And people ask me, why don't you live abroad if you have the chance, if you have a Dutch passport, which I actually happen to have as well, and studied abroad and so on. I said, because I don't want to live in another country. I want to live in another Brazil. And another Brazil depends on what, I'm doing in my daily life to make it a better place.
Make Brazil great again?
Yeah, why not? Of course. Make Brazil and America great again. Yeah.
Marcel, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me.